Ice crept through her marrow long before the extraction chopper faded into the valley. Her team assumed she was a frozen corpse in a crevasse. They were wrong. She had a shredded shoulder, one viable round, and a target 3,540 meters away. This is how dead women pull triggers. Gravity didn't kill Riley Callahan. It was the sudden, brutal stop against a granite shelf that nearly did. She woke up to the smell of copper and stale vomit. Her mouth tasted like alkaline batteries, sharp and chemically bitter. Snow melted down her collar, the icy water pooling against her collarbone. She tried to inhale, and a jagged edge of bone scraped the inside of her chest wall. A broken rib, maybe two. The memory of the fall returned in jagged, disorienting fragments. A firefight at the peak, tracers lighting up the blinding white snow like neon green fireflies. The air pressure shifting as an RPG struck the ridge beneath her, turning solid rock into shrapnel and vapor. The ground had simply ceased to exist beneath her boots. She had dangled on the safety line, 60 feet of void below her boots, a sheer ice wall pressing against her chest. Up above, the short-range comms had still been active in her earpiece. The squelch of the radio hissed, followed by the voice of her squad leader, Drake James. It was tight, breathless, but chillingly controlled. "We can't pull her up. They're flanking us from the east, Tommy." "We heave together! Grab the fucking line!" Terran West had screamed, his voice cracking with the strain of combat and panic. "If we stay on this ledge, we die." James's tone was infuriatingly steady. It was the pragmatism of a man who had already balanced the ledger in his head and found her lacking. "She's gone, West. Even if we pull her up, she's dead weight. We have to displace, now." Riley had tried to yell, to tell them she was alive, but the freezing wind stole the sound directly from her throat. Her fingers, wrapped in thick tactical gloves, slipped frantically on the frost-covered nylon of her rifle sling. "Don't you touch that knife, James! Don't you do it!" West's voice was a desperate rasp. A sharp, sickening thwack. The tension on the line vanished instantly. Riley remembered the weightlessness, the sheer terrifying quiet of the drop before she smashed into the narrow jutting shelf. Now, she lay on the granite, her left arm pinned beneath her at an unnatural angle, a dislocated shoulder. Her face was pressed into a crust of dirty ice. She didn't feel heroic. She didn't feel a surge of patriotic duty or a hardened warrior's resolve. She felt a pathetic, childish urge to cry, her vision blurred, tears running hot into the corners of her eyes before instantly freezing into sharp little needles on her eyelashes. "Fuck," she wheezed. The word tasted like blood. She needed to move. The cold wasn't just a temperature. It was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, slipping invisible, icy fingers under her plate carrier. It wasn't the sharp, biting cold of a winter morning. It was a heavy, suffocating deep freeze that slowed her heartbeat and whispered seductive promises of a painless sleep. Her right hand fumbled for her harness, her thumb struggling to depress the release clip. She unbuckled the useless, severed rope, letting it fall away into the abyss. She dragged her legs. They worked. Her knees were bruised, radiating a dull, throbbing ache, but the joints bent. Now, the shoulder. She dragged herself toward the rock face, finding a narrow, V-shaped crevice in the stone. She wedged her left wrist deep into the crack, securing it. She closed her eyes, took a shallow, agonizing breath, and twisted her torso violently to the right. The joint fought back. Tendons screamed, stretching to their absolute limit. For a second, nothing happened, and the pain was so absolute it turned her vision entirely white. She screamed. It wasn't a cinematic roar of defiance. It was a high-pitched, wet squeal of pure animal agony. A heavy, wet pop echoed off the stone. The ball joint seated itself back into the socket. Bile surged up her throat. She leaned over and threw up, coughing violently, spattering the pristine snow with a harsh yellow stain. Her chest heaved, each gasp grinding the broken rib against her lung, sending electric shocks of pain down her spine. She sat back against the freezing rock, shivering uncontrollably. Her teeth chattered so hard, she worried they would shatter. Beside her lay her rifle, the heavy Macmillan TAC, 5.0, 30 pounds of steel and composite. James hadn't just cut her loose. He had left the team's primary long-range asset at the bottom of a ravine because it was too heavy for him to carry out. She checked the weapon with trembling hands. The optics were intact. The massive bolt action was smooth, though stiffening rapidly from the dropping temperature. She checked her ammunition pouches. She had exactly 1 round left. The mission had been simple on paper. Eliminate Antonov, a rogue arms broker operating out of a heavily fortified mountain compound. They had been compromised before they even set up their hide. Now, James and West were running for the extraction point miles away, likely with Antonov's vanguard hunting them down like dogs. Riley looked up at the sheer face she had fallen from. She couldn't climb back up, but she could crawl along the shelf, spiraling upward toward the secondary ridge. It was a steep, agonizing grade, completely exposed to the wind. She didn't start crawling to save her team. She didn't do it for her country. She did it because James had cut the line, and she wanted him to look her in the bruised, frostbitten face when she made it back. Anger is a fantastic furnace. It burned hot and dirty in her gut, cutting through the hypothermia just enough to make her muscles fire. She slung the heavy rifle over her back, dug her boots into the ice, and began to drag herself upward. Hours dissolved into a singular, monotonous nightmare. Time stopped acting like a straight line and became a series of brutal, isolated moments, pulling with her good arm, dragging her dead weight forward. The heavy rifle strap dug into the side of her neck, chafing the skin raw, leaving a smear of blood on the nylon. Her body started to shut down. The violent shivering eventually stopped a terrifying clinical sign. Her internal heater was running out of fuel. Her brain was trying to conserve energy by abandoning her extremities. To keep her mind awake, she forced herself to eat handfuls of dirty snow, the sharp, freezing shock cramping her empty stomach but shocking her nervous system back online. The sun began to rise over the Hindu Kush, turning the mountain peaks into bleeding, jagged cuts of orange and violet. She finally reached the precipice known as the Devil's Tooth, a natural, jagged overlook that dominated the valley. She dragged herself to the edge, flattening out on her belly. The rock was like a slab of dry ice beneath her. She unzipped her parka a fraction of an inch. She had been sweating from the exertion, and freezing sweat trapped against the skin is lethal. She let the frigid morning air dry the dampness, gritting her teeth against the agonizing chill. Below her, a vast valley stretched out like a topographic map. The air was incredibly thin here, hovering over 12,000 feet. Every breath was a desperate gasp that yielded almost no oxygen. Her head pounded with a relentless, rhythmic thud. She pulled the optics to her eye. The wind immediately battered the scope, shaking the reticle. She reached around, blindly gathering heavy, jagged rocks, piling them over the rifle's bipod legs to weigh the weapon down. Through the glass, the world sprang into sharp, magnified focus. 3.5 kilometers away, across the yawning expanse of the gorge, 3,540 meters. She saw the compound. She saw the extraction convoy. 4 heavily armored SUVs idling in the snow, exhaust plumes rising like gray pillars in the still air of the basin. And then, panning slightly to the right, she saw the 2 figures trapped behind a low stone wall, James and West. They were pinned down by heavy, suppressive machine gun fire from the ridge above them. They were outmaneuvered, outgunned, completely trapped by Antonov's vanguard. Antonov himself was standing near the lead SUV, a tiny speck of arrogance in a heavy fur coat, smoking a cigarette as he watched his men close the net on the American SEALs. Riley lay there, her breathing shallow, her finger resting gently against the cold trigger guard. She could just watch them die. James deserved it. He had looked at the math, decided she was a liability, and severed her lifeline. He had left her to freeze in the dark. Through the high-powered optics, she watched James take a grazing shot to the shoulder, his body twisting violently as he scrambled deeper behind the rocks. West was firing blindly over the wall, wasting ammunition in a panic. They were terrified. They were going to die here, in the dirt. Riley felt a dark, ugly surge of satisfaction. Let him bleed. Let him feel the cold creeping into his veins. Let him know what it feels like to be out of options. But then she looked at the heavy rifle in her hands. She felt the rough stippling of the grip, smelled the faint, comforting odor of carbon, gun oil, and brass. She wasn't James. She didn't leave people behind. She reached into her vest, pulled out her last, massive, 416 Barrett round, and chambered it. The brass casing slid into the breech with a satisfying heavy clack, locking into place like a vault door. 3,540 meters. It was an impossible shot. The world record was roughly that distance, but it was taken under ideal conditions by shooters who weren't nursing broken ribs, severe hypothermia, and altitude sickness. She had to account for everything. The wind was whipping through the valley in chaotic, unpredictable updrafts. The barometric pressure was drastically low. The spin of the Earth, the Coriolis effect, would physically move the target away from the bullet during its flight. At this distance, the heavy chunk of copper and lead would be in the air for nearly 10 full seconds. It would drop over 100 yards. She didn't have a spotter to call her impacts. She didn't have a ballistic computer to crunch the atmospheric data. She had a mil-dot reticle, a dope book committed to memory, and a primal, desperate focus. Her fingers were entirely numb. They felt like blocks of wood attached to her palms. She couldn't feel the trigger shoe. That was dangerous. If you can't feel the trigger, you jerk it, and at 3 miles, a millimeter of movement meant missing by a city block. She did the most degrading, necessary thing she could think of. She unzipped her tactical pants and urinated on herself. The sudden flush of hot liquid soaked through her base layers and onto her thighs, providing a fleeting, pathetic burst of intense warmth. She violently shoved her bare right hand down into her groin, pressing her frozen fingers against her own skin, letting the trapped heat thaw her joints just enough to force the blood back into her capillaries. It was disgusting. It was humiliating. It was survival. She pulled her hand out, wiped the dampness on her trousers, and immediately placed her index finger on the trigger. She could feel the delicate curve of the metal now. She dialed her turrets. Elevation maxed out. She'd still have to hold over the target by several mils in the reticle. She watched the wind through the scope. Mirage was non-existent in the freezing air, but she could read the wind by watching the snow swirling off the ridges. A strong crosswind from the left, dropping down into a heavy downdraft in the center of the gorge, then kicking up again near the compound. She settled her crosshairs high into the left of Antonov's chest. She exhaled, half a breath out, held it. Her broken ribs screamed, protesting the expansion of her lungs. Her vision tunneled, the edges of the scope turning black until only Antonov remained in the center of her world. He dropped his cigarette, turning toward the SUV door. He was leaving. Riley squeezed the trigger. 72 pounds of felt recoil slammed into her collarbone. The .416 Barrett didn't just fire, it detonated. A concussive shockwave ripped outward, instantly vaporizing the loose snow around the muzzle brake into a blinding, temporary cloud of white steam. The heavy rifle stock punched backward like a steel piston, driving directly into the pocket of her freshly seated, agonizingly tender shoulder joint. Her vision completely whited out. A sickening, wet crunch echoed inside her chest cavity as the fractured rib finally gave way under the massive recoil, the jagged bone end puncturing the delicate pleural lining of her left lung. She tasted fresh, hot pennies in the back of her throat instantly. But her right eye never left the optic glass. 1. The massive 400-grain solid brass projectile cleared the barrel at nearly 3,000 feet per second. It punched a microscopic tunnel through the thin, freezing alpine air, leaving a spiraling vacuum trail in its wake. 3. Through the scope, she watched the faint atmospheric disturbance of the bullet's wake, the trace drifting against the harsh gray background of the gorge. It was tracking high. The heavy crosswind whipping through the valley was pushing the heavy slug aggressively to the left. 5. The bullet crossed the massive thermal downdraft in the center of the ravine. The dense, freezing air acted like a physical wall, dragging on the aerodynamic copper profile. The bullet began to rapidly bleed velocity. Antonov still had his hand on the door handle of the armored SUV. He was looking over his shoulder, his mouth open, likely shouting a final execution order to his vanguard. 7. Gravity took its absolute toll. The trajectory ceased to be a straight line and became a massive, plunging arc. The bullet was dropping out of the sky like a mortar shell. 9. Riley's heart skipped a weak, freezing beat. She thought she had misjudged the barometric pressure. The drop was too steep. The wind hold was too aggressive. It was going to miss. 10. Antonov's upper torso simply ceased to exist as a solid structure. At 3.5 kilometers away, the deafening roar of the gunshot would never reach the valley floor. To James, West, and the mercenary vanguard, there was absolutely no warning. One moment, the Russian arms broker was stepping into a vehicle. The next, a projectile carrying more kinetic energy than a point-blank blast from a .44 Magnum, struck him diagonally just beneath the right clavicle. Because of the extreme distance and the dropping velocity, the bullet didn't punch cleanly through. It began to tumble in the chaotic air currents right before impact, hitting him broadside. The hydrostatic shock instantly shattered his ribcage outward. The frosted, bullet-resistant glass of the SUV behind him was painted in a sudden, horrific, widening smear of dark crimson and gray particulate. Antonov's body was violently thrown backward, a heavy ragdoll tossed by an invisible giant, crumpling into the frozen mud beneath the heavy tires. Panic broke the compound in a fraction of a second. Through the vibrating reticle, Riley watched the hardened mercenaries freeze. Their heads swiveled wildly toward the surrounding tree lines and lower ridges. They had no idea where the shot originated. A sniper taking a target at over 2 miles was a mathematical impossibility to them. They began firing wildly into the dense pines to their south, completely ignoring the jagged, impossible peak of Devil's Tooth towering miles behind them. Behind the low stone wall, James stopped aggressively packing gauze into his bleeding shoulder. West ceased his frantic, useless suppressive fire over the top of the rocks. Both men stared at the crumpled, headless mass bleeding out beside the idling SUV. Riley watched West slowly turn his head. His helmeted gaze dragged upward, tracking past the tree line, past the lower ridges, scanning the impossibly distant, jagged granite peak where they had cut the safety line. Even through the distorted, mirage-free magnification of the scope, she could see the rigid, paralyzing shock locking his posture. He knew. James knew too. But James didn't look up. He immediately exploited the chaos. She watched him violently slap the back of West's plate carrier, pointing with his good arm toward a narrow, unguarded defile that led away from the smoking compound. The net was broken. The mercenaries were leaderless and firing at ghosts. The seals moved. They survived. Riley let go of the rifle grip. Her fingers were curled into rigid, unyielding claws, locked into place by the severe cold and the sudden crash of adrenaline. She let her head loll onto the stone, rolling onto her back. The sky above was a pale, uncaring blue, utterly devoid of clouds or warmth. Every shallow breath she took sounded like a wet sponge being squeezed. Pink froth bubbled at the corners of her cracked lips, sliding down her chin to freeze against her neck. Her left lung was collapsing. The horrific, humiliating heat she had generated by urinating on herself was already freezing into a rigid, icy shell against her base layers. She had done it. She had bailed them out. She expected to feel a profound sense of closure, a righteous, burning vindication that would carry her comfortably into the dark. Instead, she just felt overwhelmingly, impossibly tired. The furnace of pure, spiteful anger in her gut flickered, sputtered, and finally died out, leaving nothing but cold ash. The shivering returned, but it was weak now, just a faint, pathetic tremor in her jaw and thighs. This was the final stage. Her brain was flooding her system with endorphins, attempting to make the end palatable. A strange, heavy warmth began to bloom in the center of her chest, a terrifying physiological lie. She closed her eyes. The wind howled through the granite teeth of the ridge, a low, mournful tone scraping across the stone. It sounded exactly like a lullaby. She let the heavy dark curtain of the cold pull her under. Smell brought her back. Not the crisp, sterile scent of the alpine air, but something deeply artificial and harsh. Kerosene, combusted sulfur. The unmistakable toxic stench of JP-8 aviation fuel. A heavy, rhythmic thumping vibrated through the granite beneath her spine, rattling her broken ribs. The concussive downwash of an MH-60 Blackhawk was kicking up a hurricane of ice crystals and loose shale around her body. She couldn't open her eyes. Her eyelashes were frozen completely shut, sealed by the tears she had shed an hour ago. Hands were on her, rough, frantic hands grabbing the nylon webbing of her plate carrier. "I have her. She's... Christ, Dave. She's a goddamn ice cube." West's voice. It was hoarse, cracking heavily with exertion and a desperate, clinging panic. "Get the fluids going. Warm saline. Push it into the intraosseous line if you can't find a vein. Move." A different voice, the flight medic. Calm, clinical, utterly detached from the drama. A sharp, biting sting pierced the flesh just below her knee. They were drilling directly into the bone marrow. A localized, agonizing fire began spreading up her shin as the heavily heated IV fluid hit her freezing circulatory system. Her heart, which had been barely ticking over once every few seconds, gave a violent, spastic flutter against her sternum. Her eyelids twitched, tearing the frozen lashes away from her skin with a sharp, localized sting. The interior of the chopper was a chaotic blur of gray soundproofing, olive drab canvas, and harsh red auxiliary lighting. The vibrations shook her to her core, but it was the heat that nearly broke her. The ambient warmth radiating from the cabin's environmental system felt like being shoved directly into an industrial oven. Thawing out hurt significantly more than freezing to death. As her core temperature crept up a fraction of a degree, her deadened nerve endings woke up screaming. They registered the deep tissue frostbite in her toes, the brutally torn ligaments in her relocated shoulder, and the collapsed bleeding lung all at exactly the same time. The pain was absolute and blinding. She convulsed on the canvas stretcher, coughing weakly, spitting up a thick wad of pink foam that splattered against the medic's tactical pants. A face leaned over her, blocking out the red ceiling lights. Drake James. He looked like absolute hell. His face was smeared with dark cordite, mud, and dried sweat. His left arm was tightly bound in a black combat tourniquet, and packed with expanding hemostatic gauze, the fabric soaked a dark, rusted brown. He stared down at her, the cynical, pragmatic squad leader who calculated human lives like rounds in a magazine. He didn't look guilty. He didn't look relieved. He looked like a man staring at a mathematical anomaly that defied all established logic. 3.5 clicks, James muttered. The deafening roar of the twin turbine engines nearly drowned out his voice, but she read the movement of his cracked lips. He leaned closer, the smell of stale sweat, adrenaline, and copper radiating off his gear. You took a shot from 3.5 clicks with a shattered collarbone and no spotter. Riley tried to speak, to tell him to go straight to hell, but her vocal cords were entirely paralyzed by the cold. She settled for glaring up at him. It wasn't a heroic, defiant stare. It was a hateful, raw, imperfect glare from a woman who had been reduced to a frozen animal clinging to a rock.
"I made the call,"
James said. His voice dropped an octave, leaning his head in so only she could hear him over the rotors. He didn't offer a shred of an apology. He didn't break eye contact. You were dead weight on that line, Callahan. If we stayed, we all died. You know the tactical protocol. You know the math. I'd do it again. West, sitting strapped into the jump seat across the narrow cabin, looked away. The heavy shame was radiating off the younger operator in visible waves. He was the one who had screamed at James not to cut the rope, but he was also the one who hadn't drawn his sidearm to stop him. He had let her fall. Riley felt a sudden, violent surge of lucidity. The heated saline was aggressively flushing the lethargy from her brain. She forced her right hand up. Her fingers trembled violently, the frostbitten skin a pale, sickly gray, the fingernails bruised, completely black. She reached up toward James's chest. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull back. He let her grab the dirty, frayed collar of his tactical shirt. Her physical grip was incredibly weak, barely enough to crease the fabric, but the intent behind it was as heavy as a lead pipe. She pulled him down an inch closer to her mouth. Her throat worked frantically, trying to force air past the swelling. Her voice, when it finally broke through the frost, was a broken, raspy hiss that sounded like boots grinding over crushed glass. "I know." James blinked, the very faintest crack in his stoic, hardened armor finally showing. "I didn't shoot him. To save you." She swallowed hard, the muscular effort causing a single, hot tear to leak from the corner of her eye, tracing a clean line down her filthy, soot-stained cheek. "I shot him. To prove you're a shitty mathematician." She let go of his collar. Her arm flopped back onto the canvas stretcher, utterly devoid of energy. James stared down at her for a long, heavy moment. The mechanical hum of the rotors filled the suffocating space between them. He didn't argue. He didn't defend his command decision again. He slowly reached up, grabbed the edge of the reflective thermal blanket, and adjusted it over her chest, tucking it tightly around her shivering shoulders to trap the heat. "Noted," he said quietly. He turned away, leaning back against the vibrating aluminum bulkhead, closing his eyes and letting his head rest against the frame. He didn't look at her again for the remainder of the flight. Riley lay flat, staring up at the harsh red ceiling lights swinging gently with the aircraft's banking. She was surrounded by men who had actively abandoned her to die, breathing recycled air that tasted of jet fuel and dried blood, her body broken in a dozen different agonizing ways. She had humiliated herself to stay warm, her lung was slowly filling with fluid, and the medic was already eyeballing her left foot with a grim set to his jaw. She would likely lose 2 toes. There was no glory here, no triumphant brass music playing in her head, no profound sense of patriotic brotherhood, just the deafening mechanical roar of the helicopter engines and the slow burning drip of heated saline keeping her heart beating. She turned her head slightly to the right, looking out the scratched porthole window as the Black Hawk banked sharply over the jagged spine of the Hindu Kush. The morning sun was fully up now, blindingly bright, reflecting off the pristine, treacherous white peaks that had nearly claimed her. She closed her eyes, letting the rhythmic, violent vibration of the floorboards lull her into the dark. The pain was still there, waiting for her, but the cold was finally losing its grip. She was alive. And for now, that was spiteful enough. If this gritty, high-stakes sniper story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. We dive into the raw, unspoken realities of combat, survival, and betrayal every single week. Don't forget to share this video with fellow thriller fans, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next part of Riley's impossible mission. Drop a comment below. Would you have taken the shot or left James to his fate?